My guest today is Professor Karina Rysvik-Hammer, who represents the University of Copenhagen. This is a place that has always been important on the world map of public procurement, but it has certainly become more and more important in recent years. It was especially loud in May 2023 due to a very interesting conference on the issues of central contracting authorities. In general, the Danish perspective on public procurement is very interesting, although little known in Poland. That is why I am glad that I could talk to Professor Karina Rysvik-Hammer, so I cordially invite you. Hello everyone, my guest is Professor Karina Rysvik-Hammer, a well-known academic researcher specializing in public procurement law, professor at the faculty of the University of Copenhagen, researcher in several international research projects. Now Professor Rysvik-Hammer is a principal investigator in the project Safeguarding Competition and Equal Access to Central Purchasing Bodies Agreements. I hope it's correct. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning to you, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much for acceptance of my invitation. I recently had a great pleasure to listen to you during conference speech in Tartu, Estonia. The conference was entitled Public Procurement in Times of Crisis, National Experiences. I suppose that we in Poland do not pay enough attention to the Danish view of contemporary trends and economic challenges. Of course, it must be admitted that there is some cooperation between Polish academics specializing in public procurement law and those at the University of Copenhagen. The current activity of Professor Marta Anthoff, Professor Michał Kania, and Magdalena Socha is proof of that. However, in general, I think that the Danish point of view is not widely known in Poland. At the same time, Poland and Denmark have been strengthening cooperation in the implementation of strategic projects in recent years, in particular in the energy sector. I am thinking about, for example, Baltic Pipe or wind farm offshore. These projects often need to apply public procurement law. Therefore, I decided that the knowledge gap is worth filling. This knowledge gap is worth filling. That is why I invited Professor Rysvik-Hammer to speak about the current and future challenges in the public procurement market. So, my first question is, what is the Danish experience of how the public procurement market functions in the last few years of, let's say, extraordinary circumstances?
That's a good question, and it's a broad question as well. So it can also be very tricky, as we have seen a lot of challenges, just beginning with the COVID-19 issues, where Denmark, the lockdown in March 2020, and suddenly public purchases was in the position where they had to look for all sorts of things and equipment that they were not expecting to buy. So I would say from going from there, and you see a lot of purchases just took place fast without following any procurement rules, trying to use the exceptions in the directive, getting help from the private market in various aspects. We've seen gifts from the private market. We've seen help in purchases from the private market. So a lot of producers who changed what they could actually produce, and a lot of things just happened the first couple of months in many aspects. We saw a lot of different purchases continued during the pandemic without being put out for any type of advertising. So I think coming from there, sort of setting somehow the procurement rules on the shelf for a little while until now, where we are trying to incorporate the new challenges into the procurement rules and procedures. I think we've seen a lot of different cases and situations. So a lot of challenges in general. I think also if looking at procurement during COVID-19, we are also faced with a lot of interest from, general citizens, the media. A lot of things was suddenly placed in focus. And I think on the long run, this is not a bad thing for public procurement in general, because when the media is getting interested in the rules, we suddenly also see public purchasers becoming more aware of the rules, and we see an increase in different types of purchases and awareness of the rules and in general. So I think from a public procurement perspective and from the interest, I think COVID-19 has probably put some nice focus on the public procurement rules that we could not expect anywhere from. From a Danish perspective, I would also say that a lot of these issues that took place on EU level, joint procurement and many aspects there, we did not take very much part in that. So we were suddenly somehow faced with dealing with this challenge on our own. And I think there has been some focus on more generally, should we have more equipment? Should we buy for stock? Should we change the way we organize ourselves? You know, CBBs, they don't normally act as wholesalers in Denmark, but there has been some talk and some initiatives to maybe this could be a way forward for future purchases. So I think somehow innovative procurement has also been, at least some thoughts about it has also been launched in Denmark due to COVID-19 crisis.
Oh, now I realize that I could ask another questions. You are a specialist in the problemacy of CPB's functioning. So from your perspective, is this institution of CPB, was that from the Danish perspective, was this institution a useful tool to deal with these problems caused by pandemic, or it was neutral? It wasn't extremely effective, more than usual?
I think it was pretty effective in some aspects. You see that there was already a lot of agreements established beforehand. I think the main problem to begin with was that the suppliers did not have enough to supply, so that everybody wanted suddenly to purchase something that was not available on the suppliers' shelves. And I think that was probably, to begin with, the one of the main challenges in that regard. And then you could also say that I think very early on, we've arranged a system in Denmark that so that you could not as a municipality buy everything, but that you sort of like organize some sort of a centralized way of purchasing. So, you know, equipments would go to hospitals, and you would also have some in the municipalities, and not just everything ended up in Copenhagen or something like that. So from very early on, I think there was a very well functioning way of having the regions responsible for purchase and to sort of like divide also the different products and in that area. I think centralization, you know, if you want to buy for stock and for future crises, this is not something you can do as an individual municipality in a minor city in Denmark. So I think the way forward and the way that it's been looking into it now is some sort of centralization, and I think that this is something that could increase also in the future in that aspect. So CBBs, or not necessarily just CBBs, but joint procurement in general between region, between municipalities, has for sure gotten some attention during this pandemic as well. we're generally in Denmark very fond of CBBs, or at least we're very fond of joint procurement. And I think this is also something that sort of like stands out in many aspects. We are a country where half of all our procurement is done by framework agreements. So we don't have we already had the opportunity to purchase what we needed based on these agreements to a large extent. And we still see a tendency that this will work in the future as well. I think we're pretty far compared to many other member states in using also dynamic purchasing system for elements in that regard. And also, in fact, during COVID, there was established a dynamic purchasing system on tests. Mm-hmm. And I think this was also a way to get something faster. There was some problems with it, ended up in media and stuff, but the idea was at least good to begin with. And I think we will probably see this use of this technique in other aspects as well in the future.
This response is another proof how inspiring may be your speech and our conversation, because as you know, in Poland, I think all of these institutions that you mentioned, CPBs, joint contracts, joint procurements, and also framework agreements, are not very common, are not popular. In the first few months of COVID pandemic, probably one of the most sexy tools, I would say, was a negotiation without prior announcement. I think that it wasn't also it wasn't only a Polish perspective. We know about British problems with VIP lane, and I wonder whether it was also a Danish characteristics or not.
Definitely also, and it also continued for I would say probably longer than it was allowed, and we are still sort of like pending at least one case, but I think that was also something from the media picked up, this sort of like saying, well, can you continue buying these tests, or what happens if you have a supplier that does not deliver? Can you then go out and use this negotiated procedure? Is it urgent now? We tried, it didn't work. And I think we also really much saw a high increase in the use of negotiated procedure, definitely, for sure. I think that was the tendency all over Europe. It's sort of like maybe just depended a little bit upon also, I would say, the suppliers' willingness not to submit complaints across Europe. That's not the things that we are doing in times of crisis, but I'm sure that we will see something continue while we are getting back on track, I would say, on after COVID with this.
Okay.
Yeah, so probably see some afterplay of this, and maybe also some evaluations across Europe, depending on how much we are supposed to learn from this, and probably also some different reports and so on. And I think there was a professor in Denmark who was quoted in the media saying that in the beginning it was the wild, wild west in Denmark. Supply chains and different things were just, it was more important to, get your hands on the products than making sure you had a sufficiently good contract, or who bears the responsibility if it's not good enough, and so on. So that is definitely something that we can probably see in the future, that there might be an afterplay on these liability issues on products that did not work or something like that, did not live up to standards. But we'll see maybe we are all pretty tired of Corona, and we just want to say no more, and then no more cases, and let's move forward to some other crisis that's just around the corner. There's plenty of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. You said we will see. So it's a good moment to ask my second question. What trends and challenges do you see in the Danish public procurement market in the face of extraordinary challenges? You mentioned pandemic, but we have also situation with Russian aggression in Ukraine, problems with inflation. And for sure, we can expect rather more problems in the coming years. So what is your perspective on the trends and challenges from the Danish perspective?
I think at the moment the main challenges is somehow the suppliers who experience that the contract they have entered into is not really worth it for them anymore, because they are not receiving enough money to actually be able to fulfill the contract. So this price increasing on different markets is definitely something that is a big challenge. And you can see it from various perspectives. You can see it like, if we're looking at it for procurements that are being done now, there are more focus on putting in price index in the contracts. There are more focus on trying to make these changes, modification clauses that sort of like say, if this happens, we can do this, or something like that. So there's definitely a lot of focus on trying to solve it or think about the problems beforehand at the moment.
And have you established any specific, extraordinary new legal solutions when it comes to modification contracts, or you belong on your current legal solutions that have been established before COVID, before inflation?
Generally, we have not changed procurement rules due to anything related to crisis. We had a recent change in the public procurement rules in July last year, but none of these changes really is trying to solve any of these issues. And I would say regarding contract modification, our wording of our Danish Public Procurement Act is very similar to the directive. So we are using still the pressetext principles, and we are still sort of, we do see some case law on various aspects of modification, and without having any statistics, we might see a bit sort of like a increase in this as well. At least there are several cases that we do have before the Danish Complaints Board on contract modification. So it's definitely a topic that is gaining interest, but legislation-wise, we have not changed anything in that regard, procurement related, I would say. There's been some initiatives, some guidelines, and some encouragement to pay earlier from contracting authorities to suppliers, and these kind of mechanisms. There have also been different working groups looking into what would be a good best practice to do for contracts and so on, trying to agree with the market what type of clauses could be put into procurement at the moment. But we are trying not to deviate from the directive. I think we are very much the Boy Scout of Europe when it comes to implementing the directive. At least we traditionally have been since until 2016. We didn't have a procurement act. We were just using the directive's wording directly. So it was implemented saying, well, the directive applies in Denmark with these choices made. And we didn't have a legislation until 1st of January 2016. And I would say, since we have had our own legislation, we might see a small tendency in trying to put in a bit more national perspectives or national choices made. So we do have an increase in what we call national legislation, but nothing relates to contract modification at all.
Okay. I'm asking about it because our Polish experience was quite different. It's of course, once again, I know that it is not only the Polish perspective, but this one is the closest to me. So that's why I'm mentioning that. But of course, we also respect Procetext case and European directives. However, I think that we are not so close in Denmark to the postulate "keep calm," and our lawmaker established a few quite complicated in a few aspects regulations on modifying contracts that of course were established with respect to the postulate we have to be in accordance with the directives. But these new provisions in Poland are quite technical, quite specific, so it is for sure something different that was your experience. And we both could hear about similar national measures that were undertaken in countries of the European Union. So now I would like to ask my third and last question to you as a professor, Danish professor, but also focus on this European perspective of European law. What challenges, in your opinion, are faced by countries of our region? I'm thinking about the Baltic Sea region and the European Union as a whole in the field of public procurement. What do you think about that?
Well, if even though we have all this crisis and we have all these price increase and we have all these sort of like challenges and different crises, I think at least from a political level in Denmark, one of the biggest crises that we have not talked about yet is a climate crisis. And I think somehow public procurement has been over the last couple of years been targeted as one of the means to solve this climate crisis. So the tendency in Denmark, and for sure also in many other places in Europe, is incorporating more green elements and not just green elements. I'm also thinking of more responsible companies. How can we sort of like look into exclusion of undertakings that has not lived up to different elements that we would like them to do? We talking a lot about, private consumers can choose not to buy from companies that are involved in Russia or something like that. But what about all this with the public contracting authorities? What are the requirements when a Danish company still is delivering something here, responsibilities with human rights and so on? So I would say we do, the tendency, I would say, is besides all these current challenges that are very important for undertakings at the moment, I think we're still talking the most about climate and how to be aware of putting more green elements into the procurement rules. In the legislation change we had in July, there was a put in sort of like a delegated act. It's not the right word in English, but at least that's how we know it from so that the Danish minister can put up legislation outside of parliament on purchase green or explain. And we have not seen any legislation yet, but now there is sort of like a possibility to include it. And I think we are all very much waiting and thinking about what do you mean with green? Can you explain what green is? And and what would it look like if municipalities should suddenly start to say why they did not buy green vehicles, or why they did not buy green products for kindergartens and so on? But that is something that is going in a, I wouldn't call it necessarily a mandatory direction, but it's at least in a direction where you could sort of like push contracting authorities to think about it. So you're requiring them somehow to think about these issues in the public procurement procedures. So so I think that is still the main challenge somehow, how we can get more green elements, and this raises a lot of question on what is green, what works, and what about all these procurement rules and their requirements with link to the subject matter, and can we include it in the contract, or can we put it out for competition? Should we do standards, labels, and all these kind of things? So there's definitely also a future for academics on this perspective as well.
Yes, for sure. I can confirm that also from the Polish perspective, this debate was quite hot before pandemic and war in Ukraine. You are right that this discussion was, I think, interrupted by these problems that we were discussing before. But I also think that it is the main problem in the long run. And it is necessary for all of us to discuss that again, to go back to this discussion. But of course, we are all aware that now we have a little bit more directly touching problems that are pandemic, war in Ukraine, increasing prices, inflation. Yes, you're right. But thank you very much for your responses. It was very interesting. This shows that we have similar problems. Sometimes we solve them similarly, but sometimes differently, and it's definitely inspiring to get to know a different perspective. So thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Bye.